Hi, I'm Grant.
And I'm Kathy. Welcome back to our Change How You Think weekly video podcast.
If you'd like to hear from us every week, then subscribe to our video by clicking on the weekly video tab at the top of this page. Fill in the subscription form and you'll get our free ebook, Healthy Moods.
October 10th was World Mental Health Day. So this week we are doing part 2 of our 2-part series on mental health for Christians.
Last week we discussed that to be mentally healthy, you need to assess your body, soul, and spirit and make any necessary corrections if there's a problem in those areas.
This week we're going to talk about the most common mental health problems caused by chemical imbalances in the brain. You'll learn a Christian understanding of depression, anxiety, and mood swings and how they can be safely corrected. We will also discuss the painful issue of suicide in Christians.
I taught this to a church on Zoom last month, and I've taken an excerpt of that recording to show you. And we'll talk to you again after the video. I want to give you an overview of a Christian understanding of mental health. So let's pull up the slides and I'll walk you through it. So this talk is called Your Moods Matter, because we're going to talk about the mood disorders. So that's depression, anxiety, and mood swings. And my entire ministry now is based online at drgrantmullen.com, and we have loads of resources there that could help you understand mental, spiritual, and emotional health. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that before we're done. But you can always go there and visit what we're doing at drgrantmullen.com. But here are the questions that I actually asked God when I first started into mental health. And these are the most common questions that Christians have asked me as I've been teaching this around the world. And the first one is, can a Christian even be depressed? I mean, the church community I grew up in, no one was ever depressed. Everybody at my church was always walking in victory. You never heard about anyone suffering from a mental health problem. That was just all completely suppressed. And then, is the mental illness a sign of spiritual weakness? Of course, in the community I grew up in, of course it was, because any other illness would get their name in the bulletin and be prayed for and get a casserole, but not mental health problems. So it was just assumed that this was a personal weakness that you just didn't want to talk about. And then, could a Christian ever require psychiatric treatment? Where I grew up, psychiatrists were considered to be faith-sucking monsters. So you would never go to see them, because on your first visit, you would have a faith extraction and then you'd be a faith vegetable. So you have to avoid them. They're like witch doctors. And then, don't all mental illnesses come from demons? We're going to actually talk about that. But there's a segment of the Christian population that feels that way. But I'll explain that to you later. And don't all mental health problems come from sin? I actually had a pastor say to me, he said that if we could just, if we had more repentance, we could empty the mental hospitals. So he thought it was all from sin, which of course is not true. And I heard another pastor say, he said, no Christian of good character will ever suffer from depression. Well, that's just ridiculous. But all those kinds of comments create confusion among the Christian populations. I was certainly confused until I got involved in mental health and was able to sort this out. So today I want to help you sort it out as well. But this is the lineup outside my office when I had a mental health clinic. This is just all the Christians who are looking for help to try to sort out their mental and emotional issues. So this is a huge problem, but people don't want to talk about it. So that's why I really appreciate the invitation to talk to you about it today, so that you can understand and know what to do about it. Now, because of these unanswered questions that I just listed, I find that people suffering from depression or any mood disorder, they really are misunderstood in the community, but particularly in the church, because we're just not talking about it and not sharing the truth about mental health problems from a spiritual perspective. But not all cultures have a stigma attached to mental health problems. My wife and I were on holidays, and we came across the Depresso Cafe. We were in a non-English speaking country, but we just assumed that this cafe must be for depressed people. So there's obviously no stigma attached to having depression there, and I'm hoping that chain of coffee shops comes to Canada. Now, I want to help you understand what mood problems are, or what we call mood disorders. So that's depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. So this is a diagram of the human brain. And your brain has hundreds of control centers, most of which are involuntary. You have no control over. A few of them are voluntary. But I want to help you understand how how your mood control works. And so I've illustrated what I call the mood control center. Now, don't go Googling mood control center. It doesn't exist. I made this term up as a way of indicating that somewhere in your mind, in your brain, is where you control your mood. So the easiest way to understand how the mood control center works is to compare it to the movement control center. And we know where that is in the front of your brain. So if you want to move a limb, the nerve cells in your brain have to talk to each other and send a signal down to the correct muscle through the nerves so that it contracts. And if something affects the nerve cell conduction or affects the nerve status, then you won't move and you'll lose control of that limb. Well, your mood control center works very much the same way. In to control your mood or to change your mood, the nerve cells have to talk to each other to give you that control, so that if there's any nerve cell malfunction in the mood control center, you lose control of your mood and your mood spirals into directions that you don't want but can't stop. So the same way, if you have an abnormality of nerve cell malfunction in the movement control center, you can't control your limb. And if you have an abnormality in the mood control center, you can't control your mood. And your thoughts will head off in directions that you don't want but can't stop. Okay, so that we're talking today about nerve cell malfunctions in your brain that make it difficult to control what you're thinking and the resulting mood. Okay, so that's really what we're talking about. So if you were to take what I call the mood control center and make it look like a gauge here, the green arrow is what your mood is like at any given time. So it's always moving about depending on your day. Now, you can be happy and sad all in the same day, and it's all within the normal range. But if you go outside the normal range into the red zone or the yellow zone, then we call that abnormal mood. But how do you tell when you've gone from a normal down or a normal sadness to depression or a normal happiness to ecstasy? How do you tell when you cross that line? So I want to explain that to you because that's really important, because that will tell you how to know if you need medical help or professional help from a counselor or doctor. So let's explain that. Now, first off, the most common question I get asked is, well, what causes it? Like, where do these things come from? Did I catch it? Is it like a virus? Well, actually, the vast majority of mood disorders are inherited. They run in families. In fact, they run in most of our families. It's very hard to find a family that doesn't have mood disorders running through it. And that being true, it's also true that mood disorders can be triggered by stressful life events and traumatic life events, and even some health conditions, which we'll talk to later. So the easiest way to think of it is that you have a genetic inheritance tendency or risk for a mood disorder, but it's waiting for life events or trauma or stress to trigger it. So the same way, you can inherit a tendency to diabetes, but never get symptoms at all unless your body weight goes above a certain level. So it's similar, but these are, for the most part, genetically inherited conditions which are triggered by life events that we'll talk about. And so how common are these disorders? Well, they're very common. In fact, we don't know for sure how common they are because we don't really have a test. So we can't screen the population like we can for vision problems. But we estimate 10 to 20% of the population has a chemical imbalance, depression, or anxiety. And yes, it even happens to Christians. But it's hard to find who actually has it because the vast majority of cases are mild. They're just struggling a little. And unfortunately, 80% of cases are undiagnosed and untreated. So I call these people the walking wounded because they're struggling with their mood, they're struggling with their thoughts, but they don't know why, but it's not bad enough to go and actually talk to someone about it. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing this presentation this morning, is to help you diagnose yourself and decide if you need to go for help. Because a doctor's really not going to tell you you need help. You have to assess yourself and then go to a counselor, go to a doctor to initiate the recovery process, okay? So, and then there's a 20% of the population, that's 1 person in 5, at some point in their lifetime will have a treatable psychiatric illness, okay? So that's 1 person in 5 at some point in their life will need psychiatric treatment to some extent. I mean, not all, it doesn't have to be severe, but that there's something wrong that's correctable. So these are very, very common problems, but 80% are undiagnosed, untreated. So we really want to help you today assess yourself. Are you struggling unnecessarily because you're in the walking wounded category? Because God doesn't want you there, but Satan does. Okay, we're going to talk more about that. Now, the big problem with diagnosing people is we just don't have a test. So we can't screen people. we rely on self-assessment tools. So the doctor is relying on you to know how to complain accurately, to give him the information he needs so you get the right treatment. So that's what I want to help you today, to understand how to assess yourself and then how to talk to your doctor or counselor, okay? So let's talk about when your mood drops into the abnormally low range, which would be depression. So how do you tell when you go from a normal down, which would be still in the purple zone, but feeling pretty awful, into the red zone, which would be a clinical disorder where you can't shut off the negative thoughts? Well, here are some tools and tips that you can use to help you sort out what's normal and what's abnormal. So the normal down I call discouragement. Okay, so if you're at the far left end of the purple zone, that's discouragement. Okay, everybody gets it. And here are the characteristics of discouragement, which separates it from depression, which is the illness that needs a doctor and counselor. Okay, discouragement usually comes and goes. There's usually an obvious cause. Something happens and you're discouraged about that. You're only down about part of your life. So you may be upset about work or school, but you're okay at home, or vice versa. But spiritually, you're stable. You still feel connected with God. Life is still worth living. You still feel that you have a relationship with God. But most importantly, when you're discouraged or in the normal range, you can control your thoughts. And if you can control your thoughts, you could concentrate. Okay, so in that purple normal zone is the zone of thought control and concentration. When you leave the purple zone in the red or yellow zone, you can't shut your mind off, can't concentrate. Okay, so on the depression side, it's very different. Depression is usually very prolonged, and there doesn't have to be an inciting event. In the people who came to see me, the vast majority were down. Once they look back, they weren't aware of it at the time, but once they recovered and look back to say, when was the last time I felt well? It's 20 years. That's the average length of time a person's been down by the time they would come to see me in my office. Now, the vast majority of the time, they had no idea. They were only aware of it for the last few years when they had made an appointment. But when they look back, they realized they were struggling. So that's the walking wounded 80% group. And so what we want to help you with today is, don't wait to crash. Get help before you crash, when you're in that struggle before the dip, okay? So in depression, there's a loss of interest in everything, not just part of your life. Every part of your life becomes unappealing, boring, uninteresting. And there's a sense of hopelessness. You feel very alone. You feel very cut off from everyone. It's very isolating. Even though you're with people, you don't appreciate, like you don't feel connected. And then of course you don't feel connected to God, because if you can't connect to the people who are visible, very hard to connect to someone who's invisible. And then the key symptom when you're assessing yourself is you can't shut your mind off. And if you can't shut your mind off from down, sad, negative, worry thoughts, well, then you can't concentrate because you're constantly distracted. So I have a checklist of symptoms for self-assessment at drgrantmullen.com. So if you go in there and go into our resources tab, then you'll see all kinds of information on Christian mental health. There's loads of videos. I have a little video on the most common questions that I've been asked about Christian mental health. And then there are self-assessment tools that you can use. And if you're trying to help someone else, just pull up that list and walk through it with them. So it's a tool that you can use any time of the day or night. But here is the most important question that you should ask yourself if you're struggling with your mood or your nerves, is, can you shut your mind off? See, that I found is the most useful screening question, because if you can't shut your mind off, and that's gone on for a long period of time, then you should go and do the self-assessment checklist, because you might be one of the walking wounded. Now, in depression, there's a very, very wide variety of symptoms. Like I know people have said to me, oh, I'm not depressed, I don't want to kill myself. Well, wanting to kill yourself is a very uncommon symptom of depression. Most people are just down, sad, worried, and negative. And so here's an example. I mean, there's just such a vast array of thinking patterns which indicate depression. And so, so I just want you to realize that the vast majority are mild. So as long as you're thinking negatively and you can't shut it off, qualifies. Now, in anxiety disorder, which is just the flip side of depression, it's caused by the same chemical imbalance and you still can't shut your mind off, but the thoughts are predominantly anxious, worry. Whereas in depression, the thoughts are more hopeless, negative. But They're very much the same. But there are three causes of fear, worry, and anxiety. One is the medical, which is what we're talking about now, a nerve cell malfunction where you can't shut your mind off. But there are demonic causes of fear, because Satan just loves to drop fearful thoughts into your mind. But also, you can have grown up in a fearful family. So that's part of your emotional baggage, that your family, if you come from a fearful family, then they would just teach you to be fearful all the time, because that's just your culture. And I have a whole presentation, a whole video on how to deal with fear, worry, and anxiety in those three sources, but that's a separate talk. Now, if you were to graph mood over time, the wavy green line is normal up and down of mood. So that's what we all experience all the time. We have ups and downs depending on events of our day. But in depression, your mood drops into the negative thinking zone, the red zone, and you just can't shut it off and you can't shake it. And the most common age group to enter the red zone is adolescence. There's something about the physical changes, the hormonal changes, that it tends to trigger a mood disorder if you have the genetic predisposition. And so we should be treating adolescents very aggressively, because an adolescent will self-medicate their mood. So if they're depressed, anxious, they will actually start using substances to treat their mood. And we want to prevent that. So if we could diagnose them early before they get hooked on substances to self-medicate, that would be really helpful. But in depression, generally, your mood drops, and then you could be part of the walking wounded for a long period of time, and then there's a crash when most people come for help. So we're just pleading with people, get help before the crash. Now, we know that hormonal changes can trigger a mood disorder, especially if it runs in the family. So if you have a genetic predisposition, hormonal stress can bring out a mood disorder. So certainly menopause is a common time that depression can be triggered, but also postpartum after childbirth. That is a common major hormonal stress that can trigger a mood disorder. But adolescence is a hormonal stress that could trigger it. But there are illnesses, there are life events and traumas that happen in life that can bring out or trigger a mood disorder like depression. So just be aware that there are higher risk times like menopause, but if menopause has triggered or worsened a depression, treat the depression as well as the menopause. Don't just say, oh, well, I'm supposed to feel terrible at this time of my life. Well, you're not. So there are really good treatments for both menopause and the depression. So now let's talk about the next most common type of mood disorder. And so that's when the green arrow moves into the positive zone. So you go from a normal up to an abnormal up. And so how do you separate that, and what are those characteristics? Well, when you're in the yellow zone, instead of depression, we call it mania or hypomania, which means just a little bit of mania. And when you're in that state, you can't shut your mind off. But instead of the thoughts all being down, sad, negative, and worried, you're feeling very pumped, very driven, very energized, very excited, very motivated, very creative, very godly, super spiritual. You're just pumped. And it's like a motor inside saying, go, 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 go. And so it's very hard to slow down because your mind's racing. And so people who are in that state, they're just flooded with ideas, and they think their ideas are fantastic, and they can't understand why you don't think they're fantastic. And they stay up late at night or all night working on their great ideas and can't understand why everyone else is asleep when they should be productive. So that's an elevated mood or mania, but you don't have to be happy to be in that state. You have to be driven. And so some people, out of the drivenness, they're very angry, irritable, easily triggered. So they trigger road rage, for example. So that state is a state of high agitation. You don't have to be happy. Okay, so that's mania or hypomania, which means just a little bit. So if you were to graph that conditions we call bipolar, because it has a north pole and a south pole. And so that's the mood pattern of bipolar. Sometimes depressed, sometimes elevated. But what I found in my clinic was people don't go to their doctor when they're feeling exhilarated. They only go to their doctor when they're feeling down. But if you have this pattern, if you feel down a lot, but you have this pattern, you need to let your doctor know that you have times of elevation, because that's a different condition that takes different medicines. So you don't want to just take antidepressants if you have a swinging pattern. There's different medicines for that. So when you go to the doctor, make sure you let him know if you're down only or you have ups and downs. It's a really important distinction. So that's why we have checklists, so you can actually assess yourself for the ups and downs. Now, This is an incredibly important issue for Christians. Psychiatric disorders, at least in my opinion, are the only medical conditions with spiritual symptoms. I can't think of any other medical condition that has spiritual symptoms. And here's an example. There are 4 things we do to be devotional as Christians, and all of them are heavily affected by mood disorder. So one is we pray. Well, prayer requires concentration, which if you have depression or anxiety, you just don't have concentration. Also, too, prayer assumes there's someone invisible listening to your prayer. Well, people with depression, they don't even think the person in front of them is listening to them, let alone someone who's invisible and in heaven. So prayer is hard, and they often just stop. They just say, what's the use? And then we worship. Well, worship requires concentration, but also a sense of celebration. Well, depressed people and anxious people don't feel like celebrating. Also, we read the Bible. Well, reading is hard for anyone with a mood disorder because concentration is so difficult. And the 4th thing we do is we go to church. Well, at least when churches are open, when we're not in lockdown, we go to church. But that involves small talk and being with people. And that can be really awkward for someone with depression. So you see that this medical condition creates spiritual symptoms. And this causes tremendous confusion because as a Christian or as a friend of a Christian, if you see spiritual symptoms, you're just going to assume it's a spiritual problem and the solution's spiritual. But this is the great exception. Spiritual symptoms, medical problem. Okay, so that's so important. I want you to realize that because this has caused so much confusion and heartache and delayed treatment because they don't understand this. And so as a result, the Christians I saw, they were overwhelmed with shame and self-condemnation because they thought they were a bad Christian, that God is mad at them because they're not reading the Bible, praying, going to church. So God must be so disappointed. He must have written them off, or he must be punishing them. So Christians feel terrible about these spiritual symptoms because they don't realize this is a medical condition. And then as a result, they're hiding in church. And so they're very ashamed. They don't want to tell anyone. I had people in my office. I said, aren't you getting any help from your faith community? They said, oh, no, I'm too ashamed to tell them because I'm the only one. They're all walking in victory. Well, of course, that wasn't true because the rest of the church was coming to see me for the same problem. So if we can understand this better, then Christians don't have to go through this. And if we can make our churches welcoming, understanding places, that it's okay to admit that you have this problem because there's lots of other people in the church who have this problem, and how can we help? So we want churches to be a lighthouse, an oasis for people who are struggling because we're talking 20% of the population, 20% of every congregation is struggling this way. And so we want to be a welcoming place that has solutions and not inadvertently condemning. Now, here's a big problem I found working with Christians was Christians are very reluctant to accept treatment or go to see a mental health professional because, like I told you, when I grew up, psychiatrists were considered to be faith-sucking monsters. And so you would never go to see them because they were so dangerous. And unfortunately, even still, there is a stigma in the Christian community in some places that are encouraging people, don't go to see a professional, don't take medicines, because this is a faith issue. Look at the spiritual symptoms. So this is a faith issue. And there are still people on Christian television, because I get email about it all the time, who are telling people, get off their antidepressants because they're dangerous. You shouldn't be taking them. Just will yourself out of it. In other words, just take every thought captive and stop doing it. And so people are stopping their medicines, crashing, feeling terrible, and then they write to me to say, why am I feeling so awful? Because I just did what they told me on television. So just be aware that unfortunately, a lot of Christians are kept out of treatment because of a lie that they're believing that got stuck in their head. So we just don't want to do that anymore. That if you have this medical condition, you go and get help like any other medical condition. Now, what about demons? This is a very important issue because there's a certain part of the Christian community that doesn't believe in demons at all, and another that just says all mental health problems are caused by demons. Well, I grew up in the church, like I told you, and as a result, I didn't know anything about demons. All our church ever taught was demons were overseas and only missionaries had to deal with it. They would never be in Canada and certainly not bother Christians. Well, you can imagine my surprise when one day I was interviewing one of my patients in hospital here in Grimsby, and in the middle of my interview, her eyes glazed over, a voice comes out of her and says, leave her alone, she's ours. Well, what do you do with that? when you've been told that demons are only overseas? Well, this was an incredible wake-up call to me to realize that not only was I treating mental health problems, I was in a spiritual war that I knew nothing about. So I had to actually study this. And so I have lots of videos and things in my book, Emotionally Free, on how to understand spiritual warfare and the attack of demons on your mind. But here's basically what God showed me, and what I proved over the next number of years, is that the dark side wants to fill your mind with garbage thoughts. And so he does that to all of us. He is always giving us either temptation thoughts or just negative thoughts. He just wants to get you worried or down or tempting you to sin. But if you have a mood disorder, and if you can't shut your mind off, then your defenses are down, because it's hard for you to shut any thought off, let alone bad thoughts. And so the dark side just loves to just pummel you with more negative thoughts and more depressing thoughts and more anxious thoughts. And so there is very much a demonic magnification of a pre-existing medical condition. So what I found is, as people got on the right medicines, as their mood improved, as their brain chemistry corrected, and their thought control was restored, the demonic attack subsided or stopped completely, or just went back to what everyone else experiences normal. So that's how I knew that the dark side was just taking advantage of this medical weakness. And so that's why I love to treat this condition very aggressively, because I know if we can get the serotonin levels back up, thought control restored, you can actually use your spiritual authority and shut off the voice of darkness. And so yes, there is a demonic component, but for the most part, it's just magnifying a medical problem. Treat the medical problem, it shuts the door on that demonic access point. Okay, so I just hope that. So yes, there's a demonic component, but it's not the whole story. Now, as far as treatments go, doctors really, all they do is give you medicines if you need them. They really aren't involved with counseling or that other stuff. But there are lots of people that can help you with that. So on the non-medical side, there's so many treatment options that I want to encourage you. Many of them you can do yourself. So you can be very encouraging to someone, a loved one, who is struggling with in this way. So just encourage them with a little bit you've learned this morning. Instruction, what discouragement is, what depression is, how to tell when you need to see a doctor or not. Exercise is always helpful for mood disorders. Prayer is very important, because remember, the depressed person probably isn't praying very much because it's too hard. So you can pray with them and for them, because they're not really active in that area. Because prayer is keep taking them before God so that he bathes them in his comfort. Christian counseling is very valuable, absolutely essential. In fact, I think everyone should be in counseling. We all need it. But I think Christian counseling is a very important step in the recovery certainly from a mood disorder, but any kind of emotional issue. Deliverance prayer is very helpful to shut off the attack of darkness. So deliverance ministries are very useful. So I recommend them in combination with medical treatment, regular counseling. So what God showed me was we need to combine treatments. So don't just say, oh, this is the only treatment you need. Combine treatments, we get a better, more long-lasting recovery. And then if all these things on that list aren't helping, and the patient is still, or your loved one is still struggling, well, then maybe a medical referral is important. Maybe medications could be helpful, in addition to all these things you're already doing. But can a Christian take mood-altering drugs? That I've had so much difficulty convincing Christians to take medications because they feel it's a faith issue. They shouldn't be taking drugs, and it's a sign of personal weakness, or it's a crutch, or it covers up the symptoms. And of course, we want to be scriptural, but the Bible doesn't say a lot on this subject. But I want to take you to the story of Moses. This is actually Moses. This is the only photograph we have of Moses. But in Numbers 11 and 15, you go look it up. Moses is in a mess emotionally. He's on the top of the mountain. He's telling God, I'm so frustrated with these Israelites. I'm just fed up. And he actually tells God, he says, if you love me, kill me. Now he uses slightly different language, but that's the bottom line is, I'm tired of being here. Take me up. I want out. Because he couldn't transfer to another church. He was stuck there. And so, what do you think his mood was like that day? So here's my question to you. What did God give him when he was at his worst, very low emotionally? What did God give him that turned his life around and he was never that low ever again? Well, if you've been to my seminar 2 years ago, you know the answer to this question. God gave him tablets. Remember, Moses got tablets. Now they were too big, he had to break them, it's understandable. But Moses took his tablets and he recovered. So if Moses can take his tablets, so can you. Or another way of looking at it is, can a Christian wear glasses? You know, if you have blurred vision, you put your glasses on. If you have a low serotonin level, take your medicines and get your thought control cleared up. I like to think that mood disorder is like having blurred thinking. Glasses are for blurred vision, medicines are for blurred thinking. So why put up with that if you don't have to? So antidepressant medicines will restore your serotonin level, give you back thought control, and bring your mood back up to normal. They're not addicting, they're not narcotics, they're not habit forming. No, if you stop them too suddenly, you'll get withdrawal symptoms, but they're not like a narcotic. They can't give you a high or an artificial happiness. All they do is restore your serotonin level and clear your mind so you can choose your thought. That's it. And if you have mood swings like bipolar disorder, there are medicines that will stop the swinging. It'll put a ceiling and a floor on your mood so you go back to normal fluctuations. So, and here's something incredibly important but very annoying to most people is caffeine makes your mood worse. See, caffeine's a stimulant, and any stimulant will make your mind go faster. And so if you're depressed or anxious, you're already thinking bad thoughts that you can't stop. Caffeine just turns up the volume and the speed. So I took my entire practice off of caffeine, and they got better faster on lower doses of medication, fewer side effects. So if you're struggling with your mood, go to decaf, but just not suddenly. I don't want you to have headaches and then hate me. So a person with depression is in the grip of an illness they can't control. Okay, it's an illness, not a choice. I mean, if they could stop, they would. And think of it, look at it this way. It's a significant condition that they're dragging around a ball and chain. You just can't see it. But don't tell them to just stop thinking that way. That's the same as telling them to go home and get taller. Okay, it's just as useless. But here's just a real short video I want you to watch that will sort of indicate the dilemma and the stigma attached to mood disorders.
I was like, yeah, right, man. Oh! Oh, my head. Please don't complain. It'll ruin the vibe. Just... It's like you're not even trying to walk. Have you ever tried not having diarrhea? God, my migraine's killing me. You take meds for that? Oh my God, dude, I cut myself, but it looks really, really bad. Some people have it way worse than you do. You have to chill out.
So I guess you're not going out with us tonight. Again. You're such a flake.
Oh man, I really think I sprained it this time. I gotta go see my physical therapist. Therapy? Yeah?
Whatever, weirdo.
Can you hold on 1 second?
Honestly, your attitude sucks.
Taking another insulin? Yeah, I kind of have to. Have you ever thought about dropping the pharmaceuticals and fighting this the natural way? Like diabetes?
Nothing's enough. It's a beautiful day, man. It's time to get up.
Dude, I just got eye surgery.
Yeah, like a week ago.
Well, it still hurts. Oh, I think your friend hurt himself. I need help. No, he's fine.
So that's just an example of how these conditions are stigmatized and how we can put an end to that today. But depression is a potentially life-threatening illness, as you now know. And so here are the questions that I know you're asking and you want answers to. So why would a Christian commit suicide? Well, isn't Christianity all about hope? Of course, the message of Christianity is hope. So if that's the message of Christianity, why would someone, a Christian, commit suicide? And so didn't they have enough faith to just stop thinking that way and snap out of it? You know, just take every thought captive and stop being depressed? So it must be from a lack of spiritual discipline, because if they're reading the Bible and praying more, this wouldn't happen, right? Well, mental illness, as I've just been telling you, is a physical condition with thinking symptoms. It is not a faith issue. It's a medical problem, but the symptoms are related to thinking, which of course gives you spiritual symptoms. And suicide happens when they can't stand and take the pain of tormenting thoughts any longer. So in other words, the pain is just too great, the emotional, mental pain. And then the illness robs them of hope. You see, depression removes hope. And to persist with treatment of any other illness, you have to have hope that I could improve. Well, depression removes the ability to be hopeful. So then the despair is so intense and they feel there's no way out. So think of suicide as just the fatal result of a disease. In other words, in that person, it's a terminal illness, just like any other illness that can be fatal. Okay, so if you think that suicide is just the result of a fatal terminal illness, it's not a choice the way you think of it. So, so this is not a faith issue. It's a medical problem that led to a fatal outcome like lots of others. So if you think of it that way. But then here's another question I know you're wondering, and we have to address it. Does suicide condemn them to hell? I heard so many people say that is the unpardonable sin. That is the only sin you cannot repent from. So of course you go straight to hell. Well, does a person who dies from a terminal illness go to hell? Well, of course not. And this is a terminal illness. And you see, you can have a very strong spirit, but a diseased mind or body. And that's what happens when a Christian commits suicide. Their spirit can be strong, connected to God, but they can't enjoy it or appreciate it because their mind, which is where their conscious awareness, is damaged by a medical condition. So yeah, their spirit is in good shape with God, but they're not enjoying it because their mind is so clouded with negative thoughts because of a chemical imbalance, which is physical. So I want you to think that's why a person can commit suicide because of a medical illness and go to heaven because their spirit is still right. It's just that their body was damaged. Okay, so I want to just put to rest completely the concern about going to hell from suicide. So mood disorders are medical illnesses with legitimate treatments. Most actually can recover and be well controlled. And 20% of the population at some time in their life will suffer from these illnesses. Okay, that's 1% by. So 20% of your congregation and mine too. Okay, so we want to be able to help the 80% who are undiagnosed, untreated, the walking wounded, to get help now. Don't wait for a crash. And I have a prayer, a healing prayer for mood disorder, because I believe in both medical treatment, counseling, and spiritual treatment. So we have a very long 3-page prayer on how to pray for mood disorders. And so if you want that, I'll send it to you. It's just a PDF. And so just write to me at gmullen@drgrantmullen.com, or just go into my website and click Contact Us. And I've got loads of information on mental health on my website, drgrantmullen.com. And so we have a free video that goes out every Wednesday that you can subscribe to that's on how to live a transformed life, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. So just leave your email address on the website. And then we've got all kinds of products that will help you with mental health. I wrote a book, Emotionally Free, on the mental, spiritual, and emotional recovery paths. I've got videos on moods, depression, and fear. But what I'm teaching right now is an online personal transformation course called Free Your Mind. And if you subscribe to that, every week we send you a short video with an assignment to talk to Jesus about how to walk through the entire recovery process mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. So that's sort of an overview of mental health from a Christian perspective.
So that's a quick summary of mood disorders from a Christian perspective. We have lots of tools on our website to help you understand and recover from these conditions.
Below this video is a link to our self-assessment webpage. There you can learn more about depression, anxiety, and mood swings and use a symptom checklist to assess yourself.
When you join the Free Your Mind program, we will walk with you through the entire healing journey, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. And you can learn more about it using the links below this video.
And we'll talk to you again next week. But this week, think of someone with a mood disorder that you can help with what you've learned today.